amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am back with Hudson Taylor, Deep in the Heart of China. This book is written by Janet and Joff Benj. We are on Chapter 8, China at Last. And we are not quite yet halfway through the book, but it is a very exciting book. Chapter 8. Hudson looked over the side of the Dumfries and saw Chinese soil. Not dry land, but soil, tons of it, mixed with water and tumbling out of the Yanks River. Captain Morris had told him they were at anchor in the river mouth. Hudson would not have otherwise known because a cold, damp fog pressed so tightly around the ship that it was impossible to make out land on either side. They had dropped anchor to wait for the harbor pilot to arrive and guide them first to Wusong, then 15 miles on up the Huangpu River to the docks of Shanghai. Like the rest of the crew, after 5.5 months at sea, Hudson was eager to hear any news the pilot might have of England and the situation with the Taiping Rebellion. But there wasn't much to do while he waited for the harbor pilot to arrive. So he packed and repacked his trunk several times, then went up and paced the well-worn decks of the Dumfries. He peered into the foggy whiteness, hoping to catch a glimpse of land. It was so frustrating. He had been preparing for 5 years to come to China, and now that he was here, he couldn't even see it. Finally, he gave up and went below to write one last journal entry from the Dumfries. What peculiar feelings arise at the prospect of soon landing in an unknown country, in the midst of strangers, a country now to be my home and sphere of labor, he wrote. He put down his pen and tried to imagine what he would do when he finally reached Shanghai. He glanced at the 3 neatly stacked letters lying on the top of his Bible. Thank goodness he had them. They were his link to a new life in China. The top 2 were letters of introduction from good friends in England to missionaries they knew in Shanghai. On the strength of their friendship and the letters, Hudson knew either missionary would be happy to advise him as he began his new life. The 3rd letter was from a casual acquaintance in London to the prestigious Dr. Walter Medhurst of the London Missionary Society. Dr. Medhurst had written the book on China that Hudson had borrowed from the Congregational minister in Barnsley, the book that had influenced him to pursue medical training. He tried to keep writing in his journal, but his mind kept wandering. What was China like now? Had the Taiping Rebellion finally been victorious over the Qing dynasty? There had been so many wonderful reports about what was happening before he left England. Had inland China opened up during the time he'd been at sea? He could hardly wait to find out. Can you imagine being without any news for over 5 months? Lots can change. As he picked up his pen to write some more, he heard the first mate yell, "Boat to starboard! All hands on deck!" Hudson quickly blotted the ink dry and shut his journal. Excitement pulsed through his veins as he raced up on deck. He followed the gaze of the crew. Coming towards them like a gliding bird was a Chinese junk. Hudson stood and stared. He felt like he was living inside a picture book. He strained to see the Chinese sailors, and as the junk moved closer, they became distinct individuals. They were all wearing dark blue, pajama-like suits. As they moved, he could see their pigtails, or cues, as the Chinese called them, swaying behind them. A feeling of thankfulness came over Hudson. The years of preparing and waiting were over. The voyage was behind him. Come what may, God had brought him faithfully to China, and for the first time, he was seeing Chinese people face to face. The Dumfries crew scrambled to catch the bowline as it was thrown from the junk. Soon the ship was tied up safely alongside, and a single Englishman emerged from among the Chinese sailors. He climbed the rope ladder that had been lowered over the side of the ship. When he finally stepped on the deck, a cheer went up from the Dumfries crew. Their pilot had arrived. They would soon be on their way up the river to Shanghai. The junk soon faded into the fog as effortlessly as it had come. The crew waited anxiously while the pilot and Captain Morris spoke together in the captain's cabin. When they came out, the pilot informed them that instead of lifting, the fog was getting thicker. They would not be going anywhere today, and probably not tomorrow either. It was just too dangerous to try to navigate the river in this kind of weather. Hudson was disappointed, but he soon entered in the spirit of things and with the rest of the crew began pumping the pilot for news of home. The pilot told them that Turkey and Russia were readying their armies to fight each other on the Crimean Peninsula. England and France had sent their navies, and they were also sending troops to back up the Russians. Had Queen Victoria sent the troops as a warning, or did she mean for them to fight? The crew wanted to know. How many English soldiers had been sent? Would more be going? Had the French sent as many soldiers as the English? Behind the questions lay the anxiety of 23 men, wondering whether their brothers and sons might be already fighting in the Crimea. The pilot told them all he knew about the situation in the Crimea, and then he went on to tell them some local news. The crew were not nearly as interested in it, but Hudson was. China was his new home, and he wanted to know what was going on. The pilot had news of the Taiping Rebellion. When Hudson had left England 5.5 months ago, it seemed the rebellion would open up the heart of China to foreigners. He hoped it had by now, because he intended to stay in Shanghai only a short time before heading inland to explore and evangelize. But the news the pilot was giving him was a very different from the rosy picture that had been reported in England. The Taiping Rebellion had turned very violent. In Shanghai, a group of Taiping rebels known as the Red Turbans, named after the red turbans they wore, had seized control of the city. The city was now surrounded by thousands of imperial troops who intended to take it back from the Red Turbans by force. A bloody civil war was raging. Shanghai was divided into two parts: the old Chinese walled city, which the Red Turbans had actually seized, and the international settlement set up after the Opium War as a place for foreigners to live and trade. Unfortunately, the international settlement was located outside the old city wall to the north and was caught right between two opposing forces. The two sides were busy firing cannons back and forth over the wall at each other, and as so often happens in war, civilians were the main casualties. Hundreds of homes had been destroyed and thousands of people displaced. As Hudson listened to the pilot speak, his heart sank. This was not at all what he'd expected. It was not how he had imagined things would be during the long months at sea. But there was even more bad news for Hudson. Because Shanghai was under siege, transporting even common things like rice and vegetables into the city was so dangerous that the prices of everything had skyrocketed. In the past month alone, prices had doubled, and the rate of increase did not seem to be slowing. Rent, too, had gone up. That is, if you were lucky enough to find a place to rent. With so many buildings and homes destroyed, it was almost impossible to find a house or a room for rent in the city. This was particularly bad news for Hudson, who had nothing but a few shillings left in his pocket with which to support himself until he got more money from the Chinese Evangelical Society. Still, he had come this far, and he felt sure God would not let him down now. As dawn broke over the Yanks River in their second day at anchor, thick fog still clung to everything. It stayed that way until late afternoon, when it began to dissipate. As the fog lifted, Hudson caught his first glimpse of China. They were anchored off a low-lying grassy island surrounded by a shoreline that seemed to be made of muddy silt rather than sand. As darkness fell, the pilot decided the fog had thinned enough to begin the trip up the river. Hudson stood on deck and watched the moonlit land pass by as the Dumfries began the last leg of its journey. By the time they reached Hudson at the mouth of the Huangpu River, the fog had descended again, and they were forced to drop anchor once more. Since Hudson was a passenger, the pilot arranged for him to be taken up the river to Shanghai on another pilot's junk. The small junk with Hudson aboard rocked back and forth, but had little difficulty maneuvering in the fog. After several hours, it edged alongside a dock in Shanghai, and Hudson Taylor took his first step onto mainland China. It was Wednesday, March 1st, 1854, and he had finally arrived. His feet were planted in China at last. He prayed a silent prayer, thanking God for his faithfulness in bringing him safely so far across the world. The wharf was a bustle of activity, and around Hudson scurried Chinese men with plaited queues bobbing from side to side as they made their way along. Most were wearing wide cone-shaped straw hats, and some had bamboo poles over their shoulders. From the ends of the poles hung all sorts of things, from chickens and ducks to pails of liquid and baskets of eggs or grain in them. Hudson noticed two women. Their bound feet formed triangles at the bottoms of their legs, making them look more like horses' hooves than feet. The women seemed to fall forward rather than walk as they tottered slowly along the waterfront. All around him, Hudson could hear the lilting, sing-song sound of Chinese being spoken. As he looked at the sea of Chinese faces everywhere around him, Hudson felt terribly alone. More than 200,000 lived in Shanghai, and not one of them was expecting him. All his belongings and every person he presently knew in China were still aboard the Dumfries at anchor off Hudson. Unconsciously, he reached in and touched the letters of introduction in his vest pocket. Thank goodness he had friends who lived in Shanghai. He walked to the end of the dock where he looked left. Sure enough, just as the pilot had told him, there was the British flag raised above a large white building. It was the British consulate, which, among other things, kept records of all the British subjects in and around the international settlement. Hudson made his way to the building. He noticed as he did so that the ground seemed to rock back and forth beneath his feet. After 5.5 months on the ship at sea, it was going to take him a little while to get used to walking on land again. He stopped in front of the building and looked up at Queen Victoria's coat of arms etched in the stone above the door. He swung the door open and stepped inside. Hudson was once again in a world with which he was familiar. He was standing in a room much like the lobby in the bank at Barnsley, only much, much bigger. In front of him was a large chart labeled Ship Arrival and Departure Dates. He scanned the chart quickly. The Dumfries was penciled in under the column marked Expected, but there was not yet any arrival date entered beside it. Hudson smiled to himself. He supposed not many passengers arrived before their ship. Along the wall to the right was a counter. Above it hung a sign that read, Royal Mail received and collected here. On the counter was a smaller sign that said closed until 9 a.m. Hudson's heart sank. He'd hoped to check for mail, especially letters from his family and from the Chinese Evangelization Society. The society had promised to have a letter of credit waiting for him. With the letter, he would be able to go to the society's banking agent in Shanghai and withdraw some money. But it would have to wait until tomorrow. He didn't like the idea, though, of arriving at a stranger's house with little money, hoping they would offer him a bed for the night. But there was nothing he could do about it. He needed to get directions to the homes of the people named in his letters of introduction and make his way to visit them as fast as he could before dark. He looked to his left. There was another counter with a sign above it that read, General Inquiries. He introduced himself to the clerk behind the counter and took out the letters of introduction. Who is it you're looking for? The clerk asked. Hudson read the name off the front of the first envelope. Pickering, Nicholas M. The clerk pulled out a wooden file box and sorted through it. No, that is not going to do you any good, he said, pulling a card from the box. He read from the box, Departed Shanghai, January 28th, aboard the Siren. Destination San Francisco. Probably got the gold mining bug, he offered with a smile. Anyone else? Hudson read the name from the next envelope. Armstrong, Alfred B. Here he is, Alfred B. The clerk pulled another card from the box. Oh dear, he said, pausing to take a deep breath. You're not having much luck. He flipped the card over so Hudson could read it. Across the top in large red letters was stamped the single word, deceased, followed by the date, February 1, 1854. So this is March 1, 1854. He died a month before Hudson gets there. And nobody knows. In other words, he can't know this news before he gets there. He's been on the boat 5 months. I am sorry about that, the clerk added with a sympathetic tone in his voice. Hudson stared dumbly at the date. The man had died exactly 1 month ago. What happened? He asked. Typhus, probably, replied the clerk. It has gotten a lot of people lately. I would remember if it had been something to do with the fighting. Only lost a couple of people that way, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Bad luck, really. But if the Imperial Army ever gets tired of shooting at the Red Turbans and turns their cannons on the international settlement, boom, we're all sitting ducks. He laughed nervously. Appalled at what he had just heard and down to his last hope, Hudson read the name from the front of the final envelope, Dr. Walter Medhurst. Now that's a name I recognize. Everyone knows the Medhurst. They live in the London Missionary Society compound, said the clerk enthusiastically, before going on to give Hudson directions for the 2-mile walk to the compound. Not far beyond the British consulate, the streets turned to mud. Hudson picked his way along, trying to keep his feet as dry as possible until he came to the large, arched gateway to the compound. The gates were open, so Hudson went in. On one side was a building that looked like a hospital. On the other side, several low houses. A Chinese servant was sweeping the open courtyard. He came running over as soon as he saw Hudson. He bowed 3 times and waited for Hudson to speak. Is Dr. Medhurst in? I have a letter of introduction for him, said Hudson. The servant stared. Hudson could tell that he'd not understood a word. There was no one else in sight to ask, so he simply simplified his language and slowly tried again. Me want Dr. Medhurst. A smile lit up on the servant's eyes. Dr. Medhurst gone, he said, waving his hands toward the gate to underscore what he was saying. Hudson's shoulders slumped. What did gone mean? The way things were turning out, gone could mean anything from out on an errand to dead. Where has Dr. Medhurst gone? He asked slowly. The servant beamed, evidently delighted his English had been understood. Yes, gone, he said enthusiastically, waving his arms again. Gone. Hudson stood wondering what to do. The apple trees at the back of the compound were casting long shadows across the courtyard. It would be dark soon, and he was beginning to wish he'd stayed on the Dumfries until she docked. As sunset approached, the air was getting cold, and the few shillings in his pocket surely would not be enough for a night's lodging. Things looked bleak. Everyone he had an introduction to was either dead or gone. He looked at the door to the hospital, wondering if there was anyone inside who might understand English. As if to answer his thoughts, the door swung open, and out walked a European man. Seeing Hudson, he walked over and held out his hand. Relieved, Hudson shook it heartily. "Edkins," he introduced himself in a strong English accent. "May I help you?" Hudson handed him the letter of introduction. Edkins read it, then explained that Dr. Medhurst and his family had moved to a safer part of the city, since the compound was within earshot and cannon shot of the fighting. But Dr. Lockhart, Medhurst's partner, might be able to help him. Edkins showed Hudson into one of the nearby houses and went off to find Dr. Lockhart. As Hudson waited, news of his arrival spread quickly. A procession of curious people stopped in to ask him who he was and what he was doing in China. How did he get here? No new ship had docked in the past week, had it? Were there other newcomers? Was he a doctor or a minister? This last question proved the most difficult. When he said he was neither a doctor nor a minister, just a missionary, several people looked at him strangely. Someone even asked how a person could call himself a missionary without either correct church or medical training. It was a question that surprised Hudson, coming as it did from another missionary. It was also a question he would be asked over and over again during his stay in Shanghai. Finally, Dr. Lockhart arrived. He welcomed Hudson and offered him a room in his house until he could get on his feet. Hudson was glad to take it, and after eating dinner with the Burdens, a young missionary couple at the compound, he went to bed. And for the first time in a long, long while, the bed wasn't rocking. He was awakened a few hours later by bright flashes and the crash of cannonballs as they hit the nearby old city wall. The flashes lit up the bedroom, and the crashes made the oil lamp on the nightstand rattle. But soon, Hudson grew used to the light and the noise and fell asleep again. He awoke to new sounds the next morning. My pleasure in awakening and hearing the cheerful song of birds may be better imagined than described. The green corn waving in the fields, budding plants in the garden, and sweetly perfumed blossoms on some of the trees were indeed delightful after so long at sea, he wrote to Amelia in a letter. Of course, he did not tell her about the cannon fire during the night. Things aren't so bad after all, he thought as he pulled on his boots. He decided he would go back to the British consulate and collect the letter of credit from the Chinese Evangelization Society, and he hoped some other letters from family and friends back home. Then he would stroll along the river's edge, keeping watch for the Dumfries. When she docked, he would unload his belongings and settle into his new room. It was a good plan, but, as circumstances would have it, not one that worked. So we'll see what happens next. The next chapter is chapter 9, If Only They Knew of the Living God. I can't wait to read that one. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.